Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for coming today. My name is Mara Gittleman. I am the Workshop and Education Coordinator for NYC Parks Green Thumb. We are the part of the New York City Parks Department that works with community gardens across the city. And we're really excited to partner today with Cornell Cooperative Extension with Yolanda Gonzalez to talk about food safety in community gardens. So thank you all for joining us. And we invite you to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're tuning in from, and a little bit about what you want to learn today. We'll also be using the chat for all questions, Q&A. So if you have any questions throughout Yolanda's presentation, go ahead and put them there. I will keep track of them until the end of her presentation. And we are recording today, and we'll have the recording just focused on the speaker, but you can choose whether or not your camera is on using the little camcorder icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we will post the recording to our website, and I'll put a link in the chat to where all of our past webinar recordings live, so you can access all of them. And great, so thank you so much everyone for coming. And Yolanda, the mic is yours.
Great, hi everyone. My name is Yolanda Gonzalez. I'm with Cornell Cooperative Extension Harvest New York Urban Ag Program. Our office is located at 55 Hanson and Fort Greene, and it's myself and my colleague Sam Anderson. We've actually expanded our team. We have another educator joining us, and his name is Kwesi Joseph. So the three of us cover all of the 5 boroughs, helping answer pest and disease questions and providing technical assistance, one-on-one troubleshooting with urban farmers and gardens all throughout the city. So I just want to be clear for those of you that are putting in questions about soil test. Today we'll be covering food safety, mostly microbial risks to fresh produce. So if you have a question, let's say you took a sample of your soil and you have a question about either nutrients or a question about its safety in terms of like heavy metals and lead content, this is not what we won't be covering that today. So I just wanted to let you know before we get too further along in the workshop. There are, I believe, Mara, correct me if I'm wrong, there are other recordings and other resources that we can share if you have questions about your soil test and want some help with interpretation. So a brief overview, I'm going to be covering an intro to food safety. When I say food safety, what do we mean? Also be covering microorganisms of concern and sources of contamination. I'm actually going to take off my video just so for bandwidth purposes, as well as best food safety practices, a bit about what FSMA is. For those of you that aren't familiar, it's not going to apply in a garden setting, but I still think it's important to know. FSMA stands for Food Safety Modernization Act, and I'll be kind of covering a bit about the background of that legislation, and then just general steps that you can take towards food safety. So a few of the learning objectives. It'd be nice at the end of this workshop to kind of have a general understanding of what produce safety looks like in your garden, some human pathogens that could contaminate fresh produce, common ways that produce might become contaminated, strategies for prevention and reducing risks of contamination, and understanding the value of all of this. All of this is essentially to safeguard people's health. So we want to make sure that we are not purposely contaminating produce that can lead to illness. So in the chat box, I invite you to put in what comes to mind when I say food safety. What's sort of the first thing? I covered already that it's not exactly soil safety. We won't be covering nutrients and we won't be covering heavy metals, but what comes to mind when I say food safety? And feel free to unmute yourself too. And if nobody has anything, we'll just continue on. Oh, air pollution. Okay. Yep. Contaminants, air pollution in an urban garden, animals and other critters in the garden. And that's exactly right. Yep. Well, the critters part, air pollution is more, so there's chemical and physical risks as well. So like physical risks could be like, let's say you encounter like a pebble or something in your produce, like that's a physical risk, right? Because it could be a choking hazard, or a chemical risk in terms of like pesticides and things like that, or air pollution and particulate matter. But in this case, we'll be covering microbial risks. So things like E. coli and bacteria and things like that. And we'll get into the specifics in a bit. So does anyone remember cantaloupe, the Listeria cantaloupe outbreak a few years back? It was essentially this deadly Listeria outbreak in 2011, and the farm owners had faced some serious federal charges due to this outbreak. It had killed 33 people and sickened about 147 people. And essentially, it was caused by improper washing or improper sanitation and cleaning of the equipment that was in charge of washing the cantaloupes. So they had repurposed old equipment that was meant for harvesting potatoes, and they were trying to use it for cantaloupes. And anybody that knows cantaloupes knows that cantaloupes are particularly susceptible to food safety concerns because they can actually soak up whatever contaminated water into their into the flesh of the actual melon. So I'll talk a bit more about that, but that's just an example of like what we mean when we say food safety. We're talking about preventing things like salmonella, listeria, E. coli, all of that. Why is all of this important? Like I mentioned before, prevent and reduce risks. And your actions really do directly impact food safety and the financial viability of your farm, if you have a farm, or of your garden. Because if you have a garden and somebody gets sick from there, it can really, have a bad reputation and create harm in that community. It could be seen like that garden is unsafe. And if you have a farm, some buyers will have to do a recall, and it'll have huge financial implications. Or in this case, criminal implications, as was the case with Jensen Farms in 2011. So what are some of the outbreaks associated with produce? For the most part, a lot of it comes from leafy greens. Like I mentioned before, cantaloupe, honeydew, melons make up a big portion as well. And then the majority also come from sprouts. So because of the process of how they're germinated and there's a lot of moisture involved, it kind of creates the perfect conditions for bacterial growth. So that's just an example of a produce that is related to a high levels of contamination. And so some microorganisms of concern in fresh produce. I mentioned E. coli, salmonella, listeria, like the example before about Jensen Farms and the cantaloupes, viruses, norovirus, hepatitis. If anybody knows of a big, I don't know if anybody remembers, and feel free to put in the chat box, but Chipotle had an issue with norovirus, and it basically came from the workers and not washing their hands properly, and then that got transmitted into the food. Other viruses are hepatitis A, parasites like Giardia, that could be found from contaminated water if you're going to a lake source and you ingest some of that water. It's also called beaver fever, Giardia. And then that last one, Toxoplasma gondii, that's actually a parasite that's often found and carried with cats. That's why they say that pregnant women specifically should stay away from cat feces because it's normally carried through the feces of a cat. So these are just some common parasites, viruses, and bacteria that you'll hear me talk about throughout this presentation. And feel free to put in the chat box if some of these sound familiar to you or not familiar at all. So bacteria in the garden environment. Bacteria are essentially microorganisms that can multiply inside and outside of a host. The common ones like Salmonella and Listeria, they're often found in conditions with the right conditions, right? So if they have water, food, and the proper temperature, they can really multiply at an exponential rate. So you want to make sure that you have good agricultural practices that can reduce these risks. Viruses, they're small particles that multiply only in a host, not in the environment or on produce. So it's often contaminated to an ill worker or someone who's sick, let's say, who visits the garden and they're handling fresh produce. And it's through that fecal oral route or contaminated water. And it only takes a few virus particles to make someone sick. It's very stable in the environment, so prevention is really key. And in this case, there's limited options for effective sanitizers. So you want to make sure that you have protocols in place that prohibit someone who is sick to visit the farm and handle fresh produce. So keeping all those things in mind when you have your visitor policy, and also making sure that you have proper hand washing stations. And I'll talk about that in a bit. And then the third microorganism of concern are parasites. They are protozoa or intestinal worms that can multiply in a host animal or human, and they're commonly transmitted by water. Again, very stable in the environment, often not killed by chemical sanitizers, and they can survive in the body for a long period of time before showing any signs of illness. And why do we care about all of this? Because there are vulnerable populations out there. A lot of gardens are visited by children. Some gardens are also visited by pregnant women, older women, or just people with weakened immune systems. And so these populations are really the most susceptible to food safety concerns and outbreaks. So we want to make sure that we have practices in place so we can prevent any outbreaks, especially within this population. So again, some of the outbreaks associated linked to produce by pathogen types, and bacterial really makes up the highest in terms of percentage wise. Most of the outbreaks that occur are bacterial. So that's something to keep in mind. And why is all of this a challenge? Fresh produce is often consumed raw. It's not cooked. So it doesn't have what's called a kill step. In the example that I gave earlier about the melons, melons are consumed raw, but the washer that they were used was for potatoes, and potatoes are not consumed raw. And so because the potato harvester or washer was not able to be easily cleaned and sanitized, then it kind of caked on all this dirt, and then it was a perfect environment for Listeria to grow. And so microbial contamination on produce is extremely difficult to remove once present because of the way that fresh produce is. So if you look at a strawberry, there's all these natural openings, stems, scars, bruises, cuts. In a melon, there's rough surfaces, there's folds and netting and things like that. So it's kind of hard to reach and clean all this fresh produce. And contamination is often sporadic. Bacteria can multiply on produce surfaces and in fruit wounds, provided the right conditions are present. So what are some contamination sources? Again, humans, they can transmit some of these viruses and carry some of the bacteria and parasites that I mentioned before. Soil, water, standing water. So this is actually a rain barrel that was left open. And as you can imagine, there could be an animal that goes by and that defecates in that water. And if you're using that water to irrigate your crops, whether it be overhead or drip irrigation, there's a potential for that to get onto the fresh produce and contaminate it. So looking at your water source is really important. And I'll talk about water in a little bit, but also buildings, equipment, and tools. The example of the potato harvester is a good one. And animals. So feel free to put, someone mentioned earlier about critters. What are some urban pests that you think of when you think of food safety or when you think of urban gardens? Some common pests. Rats, mice, stray cats. Yes, rats. We always say rats, cats, and birds, and that is exactly right. So I actually attended a few times. I've attended the Rat Academy. Maybe we could put a link to that. There was one last week actually. And so that one, I'll talk a little bit about like what to do in protocol and all of that. But if you want more detailed information, I really recommend that you attend what's called a Rat Academy training. So how contamination is spread, I mentioned workers can often spread pathogens to produce because of how they directly handle fruits and vegetables, improper health and hygiene, if there's a lack of adequate training and hand washing practices. Is there fresh water on your garden? Is there a basin that can catch the water? Is there a way to properly dispose that? Is there a porta potty? Is there a way for people to go to the bathroom safely? Are they going to the bathroom out in the field? Things like that. All of that is related to improper health and hygiene practices. And are you allowing people who are sick or injured to continue to work and handle fresh produce, injuries that can result in blood contacting fresh produce and things like that? And with animals, so I have a few examples here. I give this talk often in rural areas, and so some of the rural pests are deer, but in New York City, we mentioned before that rats are really the main culprit. And so domesticated and wild animals carry and transmit human pathogens to produce as well. What's called field intrusion may result in direct fecal contamination of crops and fields. Animal feeding, rooting, and movement throughout the fields may spread contamination. Animals can contaminate water sources for produce production, and runoff, manure runoff can also contaminate fields and water sources and such. So animals, again, this is more of a rural example that this is a deer feeding on fresh produce. This could be prevented if there was a deer fence. So things, as you go further upstate, more folks have that, but there are ways to prevent urban pests, and I'll show a photo of that in the next slide. So this is actually a photo. It was in Wisconsin, I believe. And this was a contraption basically that was made for a raised bed, and it lifts, and it's essentially to keep birds out or any other pests and that could intrude into this space where fresh produce is being grown. And so if you can't exclude them entirely, you could also have what's called diversions, things like decoys, right? So this fox is like a decoy. There's sticky traps and reflective tape and different things that essentially deter. It's called animal deterrence, things that deter pests from intruding onto your garden. How contamination is spread. So water can carry and spread human pathogens. For the most part, surface water like this pond here in this picture is basically the type of production water that carries the most risk, because when you think about it, an animal can go into that water, defecate, and then there's high counts of E. coli, and then you're irrigating that, using that water to irrigate your fields, and then your produce gets contaminated. So in New York City, more often than not, we're using municipal water sources that are treated, so they don't have high levels of E. coli. But there are cases where gardens are using rain barrels. So talk about rain barrels in a little bit. Don't want to discourage anybody from using them, but I do want to just let folks know to be mindful that they should be covered. And I'll show a photo, because you never know if an animal can defecate in a rain barrel and then it's just sitting there and more water more rain pours on top, and then all that water is essentially contaminated. It'll have high levels of E. coli if there's animal feces just sitting on there. And there's also risks, right, associated with rain barrels too, in terms of like heavy metals from roofing materials if you're collecting that water. So just being mindful of that. And if you're really concerned and you notice that something's off, you can use that water for horticultural plants, not necessarily for fresh produce. You're not going to put it on your salad greens, but maybe you'll put it on your flowers or a hedgerow, or you'll water just horticultural plants and things like that. Let's see. So again, soil amendments. So raw manure and other soil amendments can be a huge source of contamination if they're not properly handled. So I know some of you might be familiar with the New York City composter program. And so that's a great way to get training on the proper way to reduce pathogens in your soil, especially if you're using raw manure. So if your garden has chickens and you're using chicken manure, or you have rabbits and you're incorporating that raw manure into your compost, that's fine to do. It's a great source of fertility. Just be mindful that there should be a process for properly reducing the pathogen load. So what I mean by that is there a scientifically valid process? Are you following some process that allows there to be the reduction of E. coli in that soil? What's common is 3 days at 131 degrees. Are you checking it? Are you turning it? Are you allowing for days for it to be cured? Things like that. So following some process for proper composting is important, especially if you're incorporating animal raw manure into your compost. And a lot of people don't know that. Like, a lot of people will have raw manure, let's say in upstate, and they'll have horses and they'll just let it sit. And if it's just sitting there and it's not being turned and you're not checking the temperature, then you don't really know if you're breaking down the pathogens that you need, if it's getting to a high enough temperature in order for it to be deemed safe to add to your fields. And so that's just something to keep in mind. There's more resources, I'm sure, on the Green Thumb website related to proper composting. There's also the New York City Master Composter Program. And how contamination is spread, in addition to animals and water and irrigation water and all of that, there's also surfaces, equipment, tools, and buildings. Oftentimes when I go to a farm, I'll see a lot of wood, because that's sort of what's easiest to build out. And this is like a packing area that I often see, and it's just a bunch of wooden tables. And that's fine. I understand that it's probably what's most accessible. But if you are looking to have a surface where you are handling fresh produce, I do recommend stainless steel, because it is the easiest to clean and sanitize. And not having wood that can potentially harbor that has these nicks and cuts, and it's not easy to clean and sanitize. And you want to make sure you have the cleanest possible surface for handling fresh produce. If, let's say, you're packing for a CSA or a farm box or whatever it is, stainless steel is the way to go. And then some best practices. Maintaining personal cleanliness. I've heard some statistics about all the bacteria that's on your phone, and making sure that you keep your phone away when you're using the bathroom, things like that. Washing hands thoroughly, avoiding contact with animals. If you're handling animals and then you go to work in the garden working with fresh produce, making sure that you're washing your hands in between. And maybe you want to think about reversing the step and actually working with the fresh produce first and then handling the animal second, things like that. So like order of events is important. If you're using gloves, maintain them in a sanitary manner, replace when necessary. Removing or covering hand jewelry. A lot of times jewelry can't be easily cleaned or sanitized. So for hand washing purposes, it's easier to just not have it on. Not eating or chewing gum or using tobacco products in the garden. And again, being careful of other sources of contamination. And then when I say clean and sanitize, a lot of people think that it's the same thing, but it's actually different. So cleaning is really the physical removal of dirt from surfaces. And it can include the use of clean water and a detergent. And then sanitizing is the treatment of a clean surface to reduce or eliminate microorganisms. So you can't sanitize a dirty surface. If you think about it, if you have a surface that's filled with dirt and then you come in with a sanitizer, you're not really going to do much. You're just going to spread the dirt around. So cleaning always comes first. And we talk a lot in food safety about having a 4-step process, removing any obvious dirt and debris from the contact surface, then applying a detergent to really get rid of that dirt and debris and scrub it away, then rinsing it with clean water, and then applying your sanitizer that's approved for food use. And it will say that on its label, so make sure that you're reading labels too. And then letting it air dry, rinsing it if necessary. So in more rural contexts, I mostly help farm managers train their workers to recognize what fecal matter looks like. And I think that's important if you have a garden where you have volunteers or you have workers, that they really be trained to know what a contaminated produce looks like. Is there rat poop? Are there burrows? Are there essentially, is there evidence of animal intrusion? So all those things are important as part of your training and your onboarding. And it really begins with your commitment. So identifying safety risks in your garden. If after this talk, you realize, oh, wow, we do keep our rain barrels like open, we don't close them. That's something to keep in mind. If you see that there isn't any proper hand washing, and I'll show a photo of that in a little bit. Here, I'll actually skip ahead. So this is an example of a hand washing station, particularly throughout the pandemic. I've seen a rise in the number of hand washing stations, and it's pretty simple to construct. As you can see, there's hand towels, soap, fresh water, and then a basin to catch the water that's been used, and then also a garbage can to collect the paper towels. So all those things are just the basic components to have a hand washing station that I think should be part of the protocol if you have visitors coming to your garden, and especially anybody who's handling fresh produce. So hand washing stations are really key in food safety. So I'll go back because I did skip through a few things that I'll cover. And feel free to ask any questions. But essentially, I'm not sure if it applies to anybody here, but I did mention before about Food Safety Modernization Act. And this was legislation that occurred throughout the Obama administration, essentially with the rise of all these outbreaks, like the Listeria outbreak on the melon farm, and there were cases of salmonella. Essentially, all these things caused there to be a push by the FDA to require farms to comply with some type of food safety legislation, regulation, right? And so FSMA is essentially, they consist of farm inspections where an inspector will come out and they'll just make sure that you don't have any serious violations that could lead to an outbreak. 1 second. Sorry about that. And then also a third-party GAP certification. So this is a buyer imposed program. So this is voluntary. There's different brands of GAPs. So there's Primus, USDA Harmonized, and this usually requires an audit or a GAP manual. So in most cases, if you're a garden, you're not at that scale. But it's good to know if, let's say, you expand in production and you want to sell to a nearby supermarket, they may ask for what's called a GAP certification. And it essentially requires you to have a food safety plan and present that plan and then schedule for an auditor to come out and make sure that all of your practices are safe. I mentioned this earlier, it's a mandatory regulation. And it's part of all these different modules. And essentially it goes by produce size or like farm size. So if you're under a certain amount, you're excluded from the rule entirely. So businesses that are under 25,000 are just outright excluded. But if you're in a certain range, so there's all these exclusions and exemptions. You're exempt if you have crops that require a kill step. So I mentioned earlier about potatoes. That has a kill step because you don't eat potatoes raw. But something like tomatoes, that would be covered under the rule because it is consumed raw. And then if you are making over a certain amount, making under a certain amount and no more than 275 miles from your end user, then you are what's called qualified exempt. But again, these are details about FSMA, and in most cases with gardens, it wouldn't apply. So again, fresh fruits and vegetables are covered, are what's considered covered produce. Exclusions rarely consumed raw. And implementing practices, focusing on preventing contamination, addressing any risks, like I mentioned before, kind of assessing current risks that you may have now in your garden. And it may require some capital investment. I mentioned earlier about wooden surfaces and how it's not, how they can't be easily cleaned and sanitized. If you're applying for a grant, maybe putting in for stainless steel tables is something that you want to consider for sure. And it'll definitely help you with your food safety, or putting in some funds to cover a hand washing station. Those are all things that you can do to reduce your risks. And then signs. So you can have signs on the farm that essentially notify visitors that they must wash their hands, particularly if they're handling fresh produce, or if you have a volunteer program, you want to communicate these policies and procedures to the public, and especially anybody who's handling food. So it's just a good way overall to promote good hygiene practices. And then I mentioned the hand washing station earlier. And then record keeping, if you wanted to just keep track of supplies that you have and things like that, to kind of monitor that everything's being maintenance, that your porta potty is being maintenance, that you have all the necessary supplies and soap and hand towels and things like that. So in summary, produce safety does impact your farm because you have, or your garden, because you have visitors and volunteers that are coming out to that may be potentially vulnerable population. So if something doesn't sit well with them, it can cause serious illness or death. So being mindful of that, I think, is important. Understanding microorganisms that are of primary concern, and just assessing risks, looking around at your garden and kind of thinking about ways that you can monitor and use corrective actions and record keeping, and providing the necessary training for anybody that visits your garden to make sure that you're reducing these risks. So anybody have any questions? I'm happy to also make a plug for the PSA website. So PSA stands for Produce Safety Alliance, and Cornell has this website that's full of information on FSMA if you have more questions or you want to take a more in-depth training. And then my email is there for everybody that wants to ask a question. So that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. That was great. That was so much information and super, super helpful. So while we're waiting to see if folks have any questions, maybe we can talk a little bit about yeah, I had prepared a couple questions that I had about like how much of contamination is really from large scale farms that are using animal wastewater to irrigate. And it sounds like there are still risks in community gardens anywhere as well, especially if folks are using rainwater or if there are animals coming through.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
thanks
and
for sharing that.
yeah, and a lot of it has to do with education, right? So if you are essentially not educating your volunteers or workers who work at the garden to know what fecal matter looks like, right? So if there's contaminated produce and they harvest it anyway and they give it out to the public, that's an issue. So if there was education around what it looks like and to create like a buffer zone or kind of understand what the protocol is for handling that.
Right. And in addition to sanitizing like table surfaces, do you also recommend sanitizing things like pruners for gardens that are selling produce or sharing produce? Should they be like sanitizing tools and harvest buckets and things like that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Anything that's used to actually handle fresh produce. So that could be harvest knives, pruners, scissors, all those things should be regularly cleaned and sanitized.
Great, thank you. I don't see any questions in the chat, folks. So unless people have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat and I will ask them out loud. But otherwise, maybe we will end early and everyone can enjoy their afternoons. Were there any other resources or links that you wanted to share, Yolanda, before we close out?
I did mention about soil amendments. So maybe a link to the Master Gardener or Master Composter program.
Yes. We have links to all of their resources in our Growing Food Toolkit, which I put in the chat and I can put in again. And I know that the Master Composter program here was on pause due to COVID, and I don't know if it's coming back, but I can put that information in the chat as well.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you so much, Yolanda. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And I hope you have a really good afternoon and a really safe and healthy growing season.